Happy Monday. It is June 8th, and we are going to read 2 chapters of the book Among the Hidden. This will be the final 2 chapters. And then we are going to have an assessment on Zoom tomorrow. So make sure that you are all caught up and you're paying attention, because we're going to do a Kahoots assessment tomorrow to see if you've been paying attention throughout the book. All right, so on to chapter 29. And again, we're reading from our book Among the Hidden, Margaret Peterson Haddix. I'll be reading 2 chapters, so this will be a long one. Before Luke had the chance to move, Jen's dad had picked him up and thrust him into the closet. "There's a secret door at the back," he hissed. "Use it!" Luke groped blindly, fighting through what felt like piles of hair. Behind him, he could hear Jen's dad yelling, "I'm coming! I'm coming! That's a $12,000 door. If you break it down, you're going to pay." Then Luke heard the computer making its beep, 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 and Jen's dad muttering, "Fine, time for them to discover efficiency. Come on, connect." The pounding at the door grew louder, and the gruff voice yelled out, "You have 3 seconds, George." Luke dug deeper into the closet. He couldn't even find the back wall, let alone any secret door. And then he heard the splintering sound from the front of the house. Seconds later, there were stomping footsteps in the computer room. "What is the meaning of this?" It was Jen's dad's voice coming from the hall, full of outrage. He hadn't witnessed it himself. Luke never would have guessed that Jen's dad had been crying only moments before. He sounded too forceful, too assured, too confident. And he was right, and anyone who opposed him was wrong. The stomping stopped. From deep inside the closet, Luke heard someone snicker. "Caught you with your pants down, eh, George?" Yes, very funny," Jen's father replied, not sounding the least bit amused. There was the sound that could have been a zipper being zipped. "Has it come to this? A man can even go to the bathroom without the door being broken down by a bunch of morons with power complexes? And you will pay for that door, I assure you." If Luke had been the one of the population police, Jen's dad would have scared him to pieces. Luke would have backed out, muttering, I'm sorry. He never would have believed that Jen's dad was hiding a 3rd child. Hopefully. Luke paused in his burrowing in the Talbots' closet. But the voice that answered Jen's father carried only the slightest edge of doubt. "Come off it, George. You know we're entitled to search and seizure. We have the reports of that computer being used for illegal purposes just a half hour ago." "You're even bigger fools than I thought," Jen's dad answered. "Don't any of you read your memos? I reported to Central Command this morning that I was going to continue my sting operation in the illegal chat rooms. See, I wrote, 'Where's Jen?' and 'Hello, is anybody there?' Which is what some lost, confused 3rd child who missed the rally might write. Are you so low-ranking that you don't know I was pretending to be the leader all along? Did you miss the condemnation ceremony where I was rewarded for the disposal of 40 illegals?" Luke wondered what how Jen's dad could say her name without his voice giving him away. If Luke didn't know Jen hadn't known her, he corrected himself with a wince. And if he didn't know how much she trusted her father, he would have been certain that Jen's father had double-crossed her. As it was, his head swam with fear that Jen's father still might betray him. How could he trust anyone who spoke so coldly of the disposal of the 3rd children? Luke struggled on through the closet, reaching a stack of blankets at the back. Finally, he touched the wall, but felt everything was smooth. Jen's father said there was a door. There had to be a door. The voices from the outside the closet were muffled now. "See the memo? I'm sure it's on your desk back at the office with all the other paperwork you never read." Jen's dad raised his voice so Luke could hear him clearly. "Or can you even read?" The population police officer ignored the insult. "Show us the computer." Very well. Luke prayed that Jen's dad had something to show them. He could not find the door, though he ran his fingers along the wall again and again. His heart was beating so loudly he's sure the population police could hear him. All he could hear were the population police and Jen's father mutterings. Then one of the officers rang out, "You're lying, George! We're going to search!" "Just because of a computer malfunction? Fine, it's not my problem." Luke was stunned by the indifference in Jen's father's voice. "But when you don't find anything, and you won't, you know that I am entitled to an illegal search and seizure benefits granted to barons, and I will press charges. Should I use the extra money on caviar or champagne?" "Ah, George, you wouldn't really sue. You don't think so? Then go ahead. Start here." Suddenly the closet was flooded with light. Luke stifled a gasp. How could Jen's father have flung the door open in the very place that he was hiding? Desperately, Luke yanked the blanket over his head. None of the population police answered Jen's father, but the pattern of shadows that fell on Luke's blanket made him think the population police were standing right in the doorway of the closet. He heard hangers scraping against the metal bar, and then the population police walked away. Confused and terrified, Luke remained huddled under the blanket. He could hear muffled footfalls everywhere in the house, and was certain they'd be returning to his computer room any minute. Before they killed him, he hoped they'd let him go back to his parents and tell them how much he loved them. He could apologize to Matthew and Mark, too, for not appreciating the checkers and card games that they had played with him when he knew they'd rather be outside. And probably he should apologize to his parents for disobeying and coming to Jen's house in the first place. Except even scared to death of being found, he couldn't scrape up enough regret for that. Anyhow, it wasn't likely that he'd seen his parents before they'd let him see his parents before they killed him. He'd have to protect his parents and refuse to even reveal who they were. Luke's mind was still racing with frantic plans when he heard someone coming back to the computer room. There were only one set of footsteps, so he dared to hope. You could have swept up the glass on your way out. It was Jen's dad. Luke strained to hear an answer, but none came. Were the population police gone? Luke kept his head down. He heard Jen's dad wading into the closet. Then he pulled the blanket off Luke and clamped his hand over Luke's mouth. Luke started to struggle until he read the words on the paper Jen's dad held in front of his face. They're gone. You're safe, but don't talk. Luke relaxed and nodded to show that he would obey. Jen's dad released him, flipped the paper over, and began writing furiously. House bugged now. Luke gave Jen's dad a puzzled look. He started to say and then remembered to stop. He took the pen from Jen's dad's hand and wrote, Bugged? Ants? Roaches? Jen's dad took his head frantically. Bugs, little listening devices. Population police hear everything. That's why we can't talk. They do that when a bust is unsuccessful. Even left one bug on me. Jen's dad turned around and pointed, and Luke saw a small disc sticking out of the back of his collar. Luke frowned and wrote on the paper, Why not take off? Jen's dad shook his head. Safer this way. As long as they think they'll hear everything, they won't come back. Jen's dad pointed to the hairy lumps on the hangers behind him. Bribed with them fur coats. Very rare, very valuable. Luke looked at the coats. There did seem to be a lot fewer of them now. Were they animal skins? Why would anyone want such a thing? He couldn't ask, though, because Jen's dad was already scribbling more. Just bought time. My goose probably cooked now. I didn't file that memo. They'll find out. Luke reached for the pen. What will they do to you? Jen's dad shook his head. Don't know, he wrote. I've survived this kind of thing before, but everything's chancy now. The fact that they got here so fast, they have it in for me. Weakly, Luke leaned his head back against the closet wall. That reminded him of a frantic search along its surface. He reached for the paper and wrote, Where's the door? Jen's dad pulled out a new sheet of paper, shaking his head, and wrote, Isn't one. Just want to get you to the back of the closet. Luke buried his face in his hands. Jen's dad wrote, Good liar. But there was no doubt about... Jen's dad was a good liar, but there was no doubt about that. How could Luke trust him? Luke raised his hand and watched as Jen's dad scribbled something else on the paper. His expression was full of concern, and Luke knew somehow that he was trustworthy. He easily could have turned Luke in and gotten praise and another ceremony, but how confusing to not ever know when someone is lying. Jen's dad turned the paper to Luke's face. It said, So want fake ID or not? Luke gulped. After a minute he wrote back, Am I safe if I don't? Jen's dad seemed to be weighing the question. He narrowed his eyes and wrote, Probably. They're after me now, not you. If they really thought there was an illegal here, they wouldn't take a bribe. Or would take it. And you too, but I'd advise to get the ID. Luke wrote back, Can I wait? Think about it for a while? That was what Luke wanted, or not even to think about it, but to hide from thinking for a while. He wanted to remember Jen and grieve her by himself. He didn't want to have to think about what parts of the population law were good and what parts were bad, or why his family didn't have any more money. He didn't want to have to figure out Jen's dad and other people like him who could pretend to be so many different things. He didn't want to have to decide now that something that could change the rest of his life. But Jen's dad had written back, "Don't know. Maybe. Case of now or never." Luke scrawled, "Why?" Jen's dad wrote for a long time. Then he turned the paper to Luke. It said, "I have power now. Tomorrow, probably, next week, next year. Can't tell with our government. Favored lackey one day, persona non grata the next. Never know. No guarantees." Luke stared at the paper until the words blurred together. He had to decide now. He thought about reading and daydreaming in the attic the rest of his life. His parents were kind to him, even if they weren't around much. As much as Matthew and Mark had always teased him, he was pretty sure they would take care of him, and his parents couldn't someday. His life was very limited. He understood now more than ever. But he was used to it. It was safe. He could make himself be happy. Except Luke remembered how bored he'd felt long before meeting Jen, how desperate he'd been to do something, anything, besides read and daydream. He'd been so desperate that he'd risked his life for the chance of meeting another third child. Did he want to spend the rest of his life feeling that desperate? Did he want to just waste it? But even if he got the fake ID, what would he do? The answers were there instantly, as if he'd known it all along, and his brain was just waiting for him to come looking. He could do something to help other third children. Come out of hiding, not with another big dramatic rally like Jen had tried, or by finding fake IDs the way Jen's dad did. Maybe there was something smaller and slower that he could do. Studying ways to grow more food so no one had to go hungry, no matter how many kids had. Or changing the government so that the farmers were allowed to raise pigs and use hydroponics, and ordinary people, not just barons, could have better lives. Or figuring out ways for people to live in outer space so they wouldn't be too crowded here on Earth, and chop down beautiful woods just for houses. He didn't know exactly how he could do those things, or even what the thing to do was, but he wanted to do something. He remembered that what he told Jen, that last time he'd seen her, "It's people like you who change history. People like me just let things happen to us." And he'd believed it. That was how his family has always lived. But maybe that was wrong. Maybe he could succeed where Jen had failed previously. Because he wasn't a baron. Because he didn't have her sense that the world was owed him everything. He could be more patient, cautious, more practical. But he'd never been able to do anything staying in hiding. He bit his lip, and his hand shook as he wrote his answer. "I want a fake ID, please." And that's the end of chapter 29. We're going to go into chapter 30. So now Luke is getting that ID. His life is about to change drastically. He went from being a third child hiding to getting a fake ID. So let's see exactly what that means and exactly how that's going to change his life. So chapter 30. Lee Grant settled into the car that would take him away from the farm where he'd found refuge after running away from home. He'd gotten lost. He'd certainly never intended to end up here. He surveyed the dusty barnyard in front of him, the ugly ruts of dried mud where tractors and trucks had left their tracks. He stared at the ramshackle barn and the peeling paint on the weathered house, sights that should have been entirely foreign to him, but weren't. Luke gulped, unable to keep thinking in his new identity quite yet. It was too soon, too hard when his shoulders felt stiff, and they still felt the warmth of Mother's last hug. He looked down at his hands, clenched together in his lap. They had already seemed like someone else's against the background of his crisp new trousers. No more ragged blue jeans and hand-me-down flannel shirts for him. He had a whole suitcase in the trunk full of the same kind of fancy barren clothes he'd laughed at all those months ago. He didn't care about the clothes, but he'd wished they'd let him keep his name at least. Yet Jen's father had been proud that he had gotten to keep the same initials. A rush job like this, it's a wonder you're not stuck with some crazy name. He bragged in the letter he dropped the night before, pretending he was just coming to ask Luke's parents to cut back the willow tree that draped over into the Talbots' land. The real Lee Grant was a baron. He had died in a skiing accident just the night before. His parents wanted nothing to do with Luke. Too painful. Jen's father had explained that they had agreed to donate their son's name and identity card, the way people had once donated hearts and kidneys. Some secret group that helped their children had arranged it. The group also had agreed to pay for Luke to go to a private school as a boarder year-round. Supposedly he was transferring in the middle of the term as punishment for running away. He'd read about such places in the old books in the attic. It seemed a strange way to live without a family, but he was just as glad not to have to pretend to love another set of parents. Now Luke looked back at his family's porch, where Mother and Father and Matthew and Mark were standing and already waving. Dad and Matthew looked gruff, and Mark merely looked serious. Strange enough for him, but tears were streaming down Mother's face. She'd cried, too. That night, Luke told his parents everything. He'd started with the first visit to Jen's house, and Mother had immediately scolded. "Oh, Luke, how could you? The danger! I know you're lonely, but honey, promise us never again." "That's not all," Luke said. He told the rest of the story without looking at her, until he reached the end and his decision to get a fake ID. Then the sound of her sobbing made it impossible to avoid looking. She was red-eyed, devastated. "Luke, no, you can't," she gasped. "Don't you know how we miss you?" "But Mother, I don't want to go," Luke said. "It's just that I have to. I can't spend the rest of my life hiding in the attic. What will happen when you and Dad can't take care of me anymore?" "Matthew or Mark will," she replied. "But I don't want to be a burden on them. I want to do something with my life. Figure out ways to help other third kids. All the things he'd thought of sounded so childish to explain to the face of Mother sobbing. So he finished weakly, "Make a difference in the world." "I'm not saying you can't never do that," she answered, "but that's years away. We'll figure something out. Some way to get you a fake ID for you when you're a grown-up, somehow." She turned to Luke's father. "Tell him, Harlan." Dad sighed heavily. "The boy's right. He needs to go now if he can." Luke could tell his father's words came out painfully, but they still stabbed at him. Maybe part of him had been secretly hoping his parents would forbid him to go and would lock him in the attic and keep him there as their little boy forever. "I've checked around some quite like to see if anyone's heard of a third child getting to live a normal life around here. They can't," Dad said. "As far as I can tell, he's not going to get another chance." Luke turned back and looked at his mother. It was too hard to look at Dad while he was saying that, but the pain twisting Mother's face was worse. "And I guess we don't have a choice," she murmured. That had been 2 days ago, and ever since then she'd called in sick to work and stayed home, spending every second with Luke. They'd played board games and cards, and she'd interrupted every move with, "Do you remember?" or "I remember." The coups he made as a baby, his first steps, his delight in discovering dirt in the spring when he was 2. The first time he'd hoed a straight row, the zucchini he'd grown as long as his arm, and the bedtime stories and tuck-ins. She was filling him up with memories he knew for the times that he'd have no one to talk to about his childhood. But it was hard to listen to. He wished they could just move their Monopoly pieces and pretend the time wasn't ticking away. But all too soon, this morning had come. Jen's dad had pulled up in his fancy car and sprang out to shake hands with Luke's parents. "Mr. Gardner and Mrs. Gardner, thank you very much for reporting this boy's arrival immediately. From what I hear, the Grants were worried sick." He turned to Luke. "Young man, what you did was irresponsible and reckless. The only smart thing you did was remember to take your ID card. I guess you must have heard the population police shoot first and ask questions later." He clapped Luke on the back and slid his hand down to slip something into Luke's pocket. Luke reached down to touch the stiff edge of the ID card his ID card. "Do we have to start pretending already?" Luke's mother whispered. The tears began in her eyes. Jen's dad was shaking his head sternly and patting his chest, as if looking for something hidden in a pocket. "Ugged," he mouthed. When Luke's parents nodded to show that they understood, he stopped patting and pulled out an official-looking paper. "Ah, here they are, your travel papers. Your parents are sending you to Hendrick's School for Boys, and if you don't shape up—" Jen's dad gave him a stern look that somehow also conveyed his sympathy. Mother cleared her throat. "Would it be all right if we gave him a goodbye hug? We've gotten kind of fond of him in the time he's been here." Jen's father nodded, and both Luke's parents held him tight and released him. "Be a good boy now, you hear?" Mother said. Luke could tell she was trying to make it jokey, the way she might talk to someone other than some other mother's runaway son. But for the life of him, he couldn't come back with a joking response. He only nodded, blinking hard. Then he stumbled to the car and tried to be Lee. Jen's dad circled the car and slid into the driver's side. He started the car and pulled out. "You're just lucky you're getting such a highly paid chauffeur," he said. "If it weren't a personal friend of your father's cousin—" Luke wasn't sure if there was a hidden meaning in the words or if Jen's dad was just talking for the sake of the bug. He decided he couldn't analyze it yet. He peered back at his frantically waving family until they were out of the sight. Soon the car was passing the other side of the barn and the field beyond. Views Luke had never seen, though he'd lived his entire life within 100 yards of them. In spite of the fear gnawing in his stomach and the anguish of missing his family, already, Luke felt a thrill of excitement. There was so much to see. He'd have to tell Jen. Jen, the grief he'd been avoiding for days welled over him again. "But I'm doing this for you too, Jen," he whispered, too softly for Jen's dad or the bug to hear over the car's hum. "Someday when we're all free, all the third children, I'll tell everyone about you. They'll erect statues to you and name holidays after you." It wasn't much, but it made him feel better. A little. Luke stared back at his family's farm as long as he could. He could see just the roof of Jen's house beyond the sparse line of trees, and then in no time at all, it seemed everything familiar disappeared over the horizon. Lee Grant turned around to see what lay ahead. So Luke is now going to be Lee Grant. So he's going on this new adventure where he's going to an all-boys prep school, and he may never see his family again. I mean, there's a really good chance of that. So what I just want you to write in the comments is I want you to just do like a little mini review of the book. Like, would you recommend it to a friend? Did you like it? Did you dislike it? You know, anything like that. Just a little 3 or 4 sentences is fine. And then tomorrow when we go on Zoom, we're going to play a Kahoot and see if you've been really paying attention to the book. So I look forward to that, and I will see you tomorrow at 10. Bye.